In politics, there are moments when everything changes in mere seconds. Not because of scandals or debates, but because of a single sentence that reveals what everyone knew but was afraid to say out loud. For Chuck Schumer, that moment came on Tuesday. The experienced senator, who has seen everything over decades in politics, suddenly realized the game is over. The reason had a name: Zoran Mamdiani, a candidate for mayor of New York, whose lightning-fast popularity turned into a nightmare for the Democratic establishment. If Mamdiani wins, it is not just a change in the leadership of America's largest city. It is a rewriting of the rules for the entire Democratic Party. Schumer understands this, Trump understands this. And both are playing a much bigger game than it seems at first glance. Trump has already made his move, one unexpected statement that turned the whole race upside down. Now the question is not who will win in New York. The question is, who truly controls the future of America behind the scenes? Mamdiani seemed like an organic grassroots movement, but investigations revealed otherwise. Millions of dollars and well-planned funding networks were behind his campaign. And this made even the most experienced politicians feel fear. Trump seized the moment, presenting Cuomo as an alternative and forcing the Democrats to split among themselves. A simple message on social media changed the entire political landscape overnight. This is not just a mayoral election. It is a test for democracy itself, a signal to the entire country the old rules no longer work and new players dictate their own terms. New York votes today, and the rest of America is watching because the echoes of this election will be felt far beyond the city. Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, leader of the Democrats, a man who has played political games longer than most of us have even been paying attention to politics, found himself in a situation with no way out. On one side, the traditional Democratic establishment, donors, moderate governors, all those who whisper that the party has gone too far left, losing touch with ordinary working Americans. On the other side, the loud, energetic, and increasingly powerful progressive wing, which sees any compromise as betrayal, any moderation as weakness. This is no longer just political disagreement. This is an existential crisis for party leadership. What most people do not see on the evening news behind closed doors, moderate Democrats are truly panicking. They watch as ratings collapse in swing states. They hear from voters who were once reliable supporters but now feel alienated by rhetoric that sounds more like revolution than reform. They see the damage caused by nominating candidates more interested in ideological purity than practical governance. And amid all this tension, what does Schumer do? He gives in. Not because he wants to, not because it is strategically right, but because he is genuinely afraid of losing in the primaries, afraid of losing control over his faction, afraid of being rejected by the same movement his party helped create. The government shutdown, which has lasted over 30 days, is really not about budget negotiations or healthcare subsidies, although that is the story you will hear everywhere. It is about Schumer and Jeffries trying to prove to their radical base that they are willing to fight, resist, draw a line in the sand, even if that line has no strategic sense, even if it harms the very people they supposedly protect. Because the alternative, looking weak, moderate, too willing to work with the other side, scares them even more than the shutdown itself. Think about what that means. These are people who have spent decades in politics, who understand the dynamics of power better than almost anyone. And yet they make decisions not based on what is best for the country, not based on sound strategy, but on the instinct of political survival. This is not leadership. This is despair dressed in a suit. And this fear did not start in Washington. It started in New York. Zoran Mamdiani was a relatively unknown state legislator. But in the race for the mayor of America's largest city, he suddenly became the front-runner, leading in numerous polls, generating massive enthusiasm among young progressives, and presenting himself as the next chapter of Democratic politics. On the surface, it is an inspiring story, a young reformer socialist, barely 30, advocating for ideas such as state-run grocery stores, large tax increases on the wealthy, expanded rent control, and broad social programs. His campaign boasted astonishing grassroots energy, tens of thousands of volunteers, hundreds of thousands of doors visited, a movement that seemed to emerge organically from the streets of New York. But here is the catch: it was not organic. What looked like a grassroots movement turned out to be something entirely different. Investigative journalists began pulling threads, tracing financial flows, examining organizations that supposedly independently supported Mamdiani. And what they found was shocking. Reports emerged that over $40 million were funneled through a network of nonprofit organizations, all supposedly independent, all supposedly grassroots, but all connected through shared leadership, shared office spaces, and coordinated messaging leading back to the same sources of funding. We are talking about sophisticated techniques that resemble corporate fraud cases rather than political campaigns. The most compromising evidence, internal memos from some of these organizations, openly admitting coordination of what legally should be independent spending. And here is what is even more disturbing: those so-called volunteers knocking on doors. Reports indicate that over 1,000 of them were not organic volunteers at all. They were paid operatives, financed through this coordinated network, deliberately deployed to create the appearance of grassroots momentum. Imagine paying people to pretend to be passionate citizens just to manufacture authenticity. This is political theater on a massive scale. But wait, there is more. And you will really not like this. Remember the non-profit organizations exempt from taxes? Financial disclosures reveal government grants of around $50 million or more, effectively subsidizing the infrastructure of these organizations. In other words, taxpayers' money, your money, was used to build the very network now attempting to influence elections. This is the same scenario we have seen with certain foreign aid programs using public funds to build private political machines. When the facade began to crack, what once looked like an inspiring grassroots movement suddenly appeared as a well-funded corporate operation dressed in a populist costume. The messenger could talk about socialism and the power of the people, but the machine behind him was anything but grassroots. It was manufactured, coordinated, and potentially illegal. And this revelation did not just shake New York. It scared the very people who built this system. Because here is what Schumer and Jeffries understand that most people do not: when the public sees through the illusion, when they realize they were sold a false story, the reaction is swift and merciless. Trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to restore. And in politics, trust is currency. Suddenly, the investigations that initially seemed like news for a narrow circle of political insiders became front-page headlines. Voters who admired Mamdiani began asking uncomfortable questions. Moderate Democrats, pressured to remain silent, found their voice. And on both sides of party lines, people began to recognize the pattern. This was not just one candidate in one race. This was a systematic attempt to reshape American democracy through manufactured movements and dark money networks. The myth of grassroots support did not just evaporate in New York. It revealed a vulnerability spreading across the country. Because if it happened here, in America's largest city, in one of the most tightly controlled political environments in the country, where else is it happening? How many other grassroots movements are really well-funded operations designed to look authentic? And then Trump intervened, not with a rally, but with a single calculated statement. Love him or hate him, and people feel strong emotions in both directions. You have to acknowledge Trump's sense of timing. While everyone else was caught up in the scandal, while the media was busy parsing financial documents and interviewing campaign operatives, Trump waited. He observed. And then, at exactly the right moment, he made his move. On Truth Social, his favorite platform, Trump posted what appeared to be a simple statement, but functioned more as a chess move than a comment. He essentially said, if Mamdiani wins, federal funding for New York will be minimal, limited only to what is legally required. No discretionary grants, no special exceptions, only the absolute minimum. At first glance, this might seem harsh, even punitive. But consider the internal message. Trump was saying, if you elect someone financed through dubious methods, whose campaign seems to violate tax law, supported by networks, potentially laundering money, and using taxpayer resources for political gain, do not expect federal cooperation. Actions have consequences. Elections have consequences. Most people expected Trump to support Curtis Sliwa, the Republican candidate in the race. That would have been the obvious move: back his party's candidate, rally the base, make it a partisan battle. But Trump did not do that. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone. He pointed to Andrew Cuomo, the former Democratic governor who resigned amid scandal, whom most had considered finished. Trump understood something that traditional politicians often miss. Sometimes the best strategy is not to win the argument yourself, but to create conditions in which your opposition defeats itself. By elevating Cuomo as a potential alternative, Trump was not trying to install his preferred candidate. He was trying to fracture the Democratic coalition. He gave moderate Democrats, and even some Republicans, the framework to vote against Mamdiani without necessarily voting for Sliwa. He turned a simple election into a three-tier ideological battle, where the progressive wing would simultaneously fight moderates and conservatives. It is brilliant in its simplicity, and devastatingly effective. The message did not just make headlines, it reshaped the race overnight. Within hours, the political landscape changed. Moderate Democrats, who had been holding their noses and preparing to vote for Mamdiani out of party loyalty, suddenly had an option. Cuomo, despite all his flaws and baggage, offered what Mamdiani lacked: experience, establishment authority, and most importantly, a signal that the party could still correct course, still reject its most extreme elements without capitulating entirely to Republicans. Behind the scenes, panic intensified. Democratic donors, those who actually write the checks supporting campaigns, began calling. Governors from other blue states began questioning strategy. Even some progressive members of Congress, seeing the writing on the wall, quietly distanced themselves from Mamdiani's most radical proposals. The coalition that had seemed so confident just weeks ago was unraveling in real time. And Schumer watched it all collapse, because it was the very trap he had set for himself. This was the moment Schumer realized he had been playing the wrong game. His entire strategy of appeasing the progressive wing, shutting down the government to prove resistance power, staying silent about Mamdiani's campaign because he did not want to anger the base, it all exploded catastrophically. Now he faces an impossible choice. If he supports Mamdiani, he legitimizes everything the campaign represents, including potentially illegal funding mechanisms. He owns everything that comes next. But if he distances himself, if he speaks out about the problems, he fractures his own party right before crucial elections and validates everything Trump has said about Democratic dysfunction. Any path leads to a loss of control over the narrative. Any path weakens his position. The silence before the storm behind closed doors was palpable. Jeffries, who had reluctantly supported Mamdiani earlier, seemed to receive angry calls from moderate members of his faction, who felt betrayed, who worried that they would be associated with a campaign now under investigation. Democratic strategists ran scenarios, trying to determine how to contain damage not only in New York but across the country, because they understood that what happens in this election will have reverberations for years. And the cracks in New York reflected something much bigger nationwide. Because here is what the political class does not always see, but ordinary Americans feel in their bones. In recent years there has been a quiet uprising, not the type that makes the news. Not the type with protests and placards. But the type that shows up in voter registration data, in trucks moving from blue states to red, in people quietly deciding they have had enough of politics. That sounds good in theory but catastrophically fails in practice. Across the country, the numbers tell a harsh story. In every state tracking voter registration by party affiliation, we are talking about more than 24 states. Democrats are losing registered voters, while Republicans are gaining. Not by small margins, by hundreds of thousands. Working families, minorities, young people, demographic groups Democrats considered their own are shifting to other parties or becoming independents at historic rates. Why? Because slogans do not pay the bills. Because ideology does not put food on the table. Because when you struggle to afford groceries, rent, and gas, when you see your city deteriorate despite promises of progress, when you see your taxes fund programs that seem to help no one except administrators and consultants, at some point, you stop listening to what politicians say and start judging them by the results. The more the Democratic Party leaned left, the faster its base eroded. This is not a coincidence, this is cause and effect. They entered what economists call a doom loop. Their policies create problems that drive people away, which forces them to rely even more on their activist base, which pushes them to adopt even more extreme policies, which create even more problems. And so it goes in a circle. 8 of the 10 states with the highest housing costs, these are states with predominantly Democratic leadership. Think about that. Places with the strongest Democratic control, places where ordinary families cannot afford to live. The same pattern appears with taxes, public safety, education, quality. Ideology that promises to help working people has, in practice, made their lives evidently harder. And this is why Trump's message resonates even with people who personally dislike him, because he points to the pattern, names it, refuses to pretend it does not exist. It is the same loop Schumer is stuck in, and the same one Trump knows how to break. While the media focuses on outrage, and believe me, there was plenty, Trump focuses on levers of influence. And that is the difference between playing politics and playing the long game. Most politicians think in 2 or 4-year cycles, elections, terms, the next campaign. Trump thinks in decades. He tries not to win individual battles. He tries to reshape the battlefield itself. Every Democratic overreach, every failed policy, Every scandal similar to the revelations about Mamdiani's funding, he turns it into a case study. Not just for these elections, but for the next ones, and those after them. History does not change when leaders give speeches. It changes when people stop believing the performance. And that is exactly why we are witnessing now a performance that has supported democratic power in large cities for generations. The idea that they fight for working people. That more government programs mean more help. That intentions matter more than results. This performance collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. New Yorkers watch their city decline and are told it is progress. They pay more for less, and they are told they are not paying enough. They see crime rise, and they are told the police are the problem. They watch businesses leave the city, and they are told regulations protect them. At some point, cognitive dissonance becomes too great. At some point, people start trusting their own eyes instead of the narrative. And this awakening, this quiet realization spreading across blue cities and states throughout America, this is the real story. Not who wins these specific mayoral elections, although that matters. But whether we are witnessing the beginning of a true political reshuffling, where a party that positioned itself as a defender of working people loses working people because it has stopped actually defending them. Trump did not have to shout this time. He did not have to dominate news cycles with controversial statements. He simply waited and let them fall into the trap themselves. This is the difference between playing politics and changing politics. Between winning news cycles and winning the long game. Between forcing yourself through obstacles and letting obstacles consume your opposition. New York votes today. The rest of the country watches. And whatever happens in this election, it will reverberate far beyond one city, one race, one moment.